The antique pocket watch caught the auctioneer's light perfectly from across the room. I raised my paddle without hesitation. 42 years ago, my father had worn one just like it while teaching me how to read a balance sheet in the back office of our first hardware store. When the auctioneer's gavel came down and the young woman beside me groaned in disappointment, I felt the small, satisfying click of something returning to where it belonged. That feeling lasted exactly 4 minutes. My phone buzzed inside my jacket as I stood to collect my bid sheet. I assumed it was my daughter-in-law reminding me about dinner. She had been sending a lot of reminders lately, always with that particular sweetness that felt like someone tightening a knot slowly enough that you didn't notice until it was too late. The message was from a number I didn't recognize. Mr. Calloway, don't sign anything your son puts in front of you. I know what he's planning. Call me. I read it 3 times. Around me, the auction house continued its pleasant Saturday morning rhythm. Paddles rising and falling, voices murmuring over coffee cups, an elderly couple arguing quietly about a Victorian lamp. I stood perfectly still in the middle of all of it with a pocket watch in one hand and a phone in the other, and the distinct sensation that the floor had shifted beneath my feet. I am 64 years old. I built Callaway Hardware Supply from a single shop on Maple Street in Fort Wayne, Indiana, into 11 locations across 3 states. I have survived 2 recessions, a divorce that nearly broke me, and the death of my second wife, Carol, who passed from ovarian cancer 3 years ago and left a silence in my house so complete that some mornings I turned on every television just to fill it. I have negotiated with union representatives who brought lawyers and with suppliers who brought threats, and I have always known, with the certainty of a man who has made his share of mistakes and learned from every one of them, when something was genuinely wrong. Something was genuinely wrong. I dialed the number immediately. It rang 4 times and went to a generic voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. I paid for the pocket watch, tucked it into my breast pocket, and drove the 40 minutes back to Fort Wayne on autopilot, replaying every recent conversation with my son and his wife, like footage from a security camera I had forgotten to check. My son is 38. He came to work for me 6 years ago after his marketing firm downsized, and I had been grateful for it in the way fathers always are when their children circle back. He learned the business quickly. He asked smart questions. He started attending supplier meetings and sitting in on negotiations, and I told myself this was exactly how these things were supposed to go. A man building something worth passing down and watching someone worthy receive it. My daughter-in-law handles the administrative side. She has a business degree from Purdue and an organizational efficiency that I genuinely admire, though lately her efficiency had begun to feel more like documentation. She had started CCing herself on my emails. She had started attending my meetings with the accountant. She had started using the phrase, "at this stage of the business," in ways that seemed to mean something other than what it said. I did not go to dinner that evening. I texted my son that I had a headache and would see them Sunday. Then I sat in my kitchen and called the unknown number 7 more times before giving up and making coffee I didn't drink. The second message arrived at 11:45 that night. I work at Morrison, Ellis, and Crane. I overheard a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. Your son and his wife were meeting with Daniel Ellis about legal procedures. They had paperwork, Mr. Calloway. Guardianship paperwork. Please call me in the morning. Morrison, Ellis, and Crane was one of the 3 most respected law firms in Fort Wayne. I had used their competitor for 20 years and knew their reputation the way you know the competition in a city this size. Daniel Ellis handled estates and family law, the kind of attorney you called when you needed to restructure assets or when a family situation required, as the firm's website phrased it, sensitive legal navigation. I sat with the message for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed on the street outside. Carol's roses were just beginning to come in through the kitchen window, the ones she planted the spring before she got sick, and I had kept them alive through 2 winters, mostly out of stubbornness. I did not sleep. By 6 in the morning, I had made a decision. I called the front desk at the Marriott downtown and booked a room for 2 nights. I packed a bag, took my laptop, and drove to the hotel in the early gray light before anyone on my street was awake. I sent my son a text saying I was feeling unwell and might need a few days of quiet. He responded within 4 minutes. Of course, Dad. Rest up. Don't worry about anything at the office. We've got it covered. The speed of that response told me more than the words. The unknown number finally answered at 8:17. The voice was a woman's, young, cautious, speaking just above a whisper. She told me her name was Jennifer, and that she was a paralegal at Morrison, Ellis and Crane. She had been in Daniel Ellis's conference room preparing documents when my son and daughter-in-law arrived for a late appointment on Thursday. She said she should have left immediately when she realized what the meeting was about, but found herself frozen, listening through the cracked door to a conversation she described as not something a person could easily forget. My son had brought a folder. Inside, according to Jennifer, were printed records he claimed demonstrated a pattern of cognitive decline. Missed appointments, which I had missed because I had been at Carol's oncologist with her. Confused directives to employees, which were emails from 2 years ago that I had sent during a week when Carol was in the hospital, and I had been running on 4 hours of sleep and grief I hadn't yet learned to manage. A complaint from a supplier, which I knew had been resolved, and which my son had apparently photocopied before it was. He had organized them chronologically and presented them to Daniel Ellis with the smooth confidence of someone who had practiced. My daughter-in-law had done most of the talking about the medical portion. She had a doctor's name. She explained the evaluation process. She used the phrase, "He's not going to put up much resistance," in a tone that Jennifer described as very matter-of-fact, the way you might discuss a logistical detail, rather than your father-in-law's independence. I thanked Jennifer and asked her why she was telling me this. She paused for a moment. "Because my grandfather went through something similar," she said, "and nobody warned him in time. I stayed in that hotel room for most of the day. I ordered room service I barely touched. I walked to the window and looked at Fort Wayne spread out below me, the same city where my father had handed me a set of store keys on my 22nd birthday and told me that what I built would outlast both of us. And I thought about 42 years of early mornings and difficult decisions and every weekend I had sacrificed and whether any of it had meant what I thought it meant. Then I stopped feeling sorry for myself, because self-pity has never once built anything. I opened my laptop and started working. By evening, I had contacted 3 people. The first was Raymond Cho, who had been my accountant for 19 years and who I trusted with the kind of absolute certainty that comes from watching someone refuse a shortcut in front of you. I told Raymond I needed a complete audit of every account my son had any access to, and I needed it done quietly and quickly. Raymond asked no questions and said he would have preliminary results by Tuesday. The second call was to my attorney, Patricia Marsh, who had handled the legal side of Callaway Hardware Supply for a decade, and who reacted to my summary of events with a silence so sharp it felt like a blade being drawn. "Forward me everything Jennifer told you," Patricia said. "And Walter, do not sign a single document until you speak with me. Not a purchase order, not a vendor renewal, nothing." The third call was harder. I sat with the phone in my hand for 20 minutes before I made it. My daughter lives in Portland. She and her brother have never been particularly close, which I had always attributed to the ordinary friction of siblings and a 12-year age gap. Listening to her voice, I began to wonder if she had seen something I had missed. I did not tell her everything. I told her I was cleaning up some estate details following Carol's passing and thought it would be a good time for her to come visit. She heard something in my voice that daughters often hear in fathers' voices before the fathers themselves know it is there, and she booked a flight before we hung up. I returned home on Monday morning. The performance I gave over the next 4 days was, I believe, the finest work of my life. And I say that as someone who once negotiated 11-location expansion deal over a handshake lunch. I shuffled slightly when I walked. Not dramatically, just enough. I referred to my son's name occasionally with a half-second delay, the kind of pause that could easily read as a man slowing down. I asked my daughter-in-law to remind me of appointments I knew perfectly well. Once, during dinner, I searched for the word inventory for just a moment longer than necessary and watched her eyes move to my son's with the practiced efficiency of 2 people communicating without speaking. They were very kind about it. That was the part that cost me something. The kindness was real enough, wrapped around something else, but it was real. My son brought me coffee in the mornings and sat with me on the back porch and talked about the business with the careful patience of a man who believes he is managing a transition. My daughter-in-law cooked 3 dinners that week, dishes I actually loved, and asked about Carol with what seemed like genuine softness. I smiled and thanked them, and let the recording app run in my shirt pocket. Raymond called on Tuesday with the preliminary results. My son had been transferring small amounts from the company's secondary operating account into a separate business entity registered 6 months ago. Nothing large enough to trigger automatic alerts. 11 transfers over 8 months, totaling $63,000. The business entity was registered under my daughter-in-law's maiden name. That evening, my son mentioned casually that he had spoken with a doctor, Gerald Fauser, about scheduling a routine wellness evaluation for me. He framed it as something the company's insurance provider had suggested. Dr. Fauser, according to Patricia's research, had twice been the subject of medical board inquiries related to evaluations performed in civil proceedings, neither of which had resulted in formal action. "That sounds thoughtful," I said. "What day were you thinking?" My son looked so relieved that something moved in my chest that I did not want to examine too closely. My daughter arrived Wednesday evening. I picked her up from the airport alone, which she seemed surprised by, and on the drive home I told her everything. She sat in the passenger seat and stared at the road ahead and did not speak for a very long time. When she finally did, her voice was the particular quiet of someone who has received news they had already been preparing for without knowing it. "How long?" she asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. She reached across and held my hand on the gear shift the way she used to when she was 7 years old, and we drove to the hardware store on Sunday mornings. Neither of us said anything else until we pulled into the driveway. The family dinner had been my son's idea. He had planned it as a celebration of what he called a new chapter for the business. A formal evening at the Fort Wayne Country Club with extended family, longtime employees, and several business partners. He had framed it to me as a tribute to my legacy, a chance for everyone to come together. He had been planning it for 6 weeks. I let him keep planning it. Thursday morning, I met with Patricia for 2 hours. We reviewed the recordings, the financial transfers Raymond had documented, Jennifer's account, and Dr. Fauser's professional history. Patricia set her pen down at the end and looked at me with the expression of someone confirming a diagnosis they had hoped was wrong. "Everything here is actionable," she said. "The question is how you want to proceed." "I want to proceed on Saturday," I said, in front of everyone. Patricia looked at me for a long moment. "That's your right," she said carefully. "But Walter, it will be public, and it will be permanent. There's no walking it back." "I know," I said. She nodded once and got back to work. Friday, I called a man named Donald Briggs, who owned an audio-visual production company that Callaway Hardware Supply had used for trade show presentations. I needed a wireless microphone system and 2 discrete speakers appropriate for a formal dining room. Donald was professional and asked no unnecessary questions and promised everything would be set up before the first guests arrived. Friday evening, my son stopped by with a copy of the evening's program. He had printed the agenda on heavy cream stock and had written "An Evening in Honor of Walter Callaway" across the top in embossed letters. He handed it to me with a smile that I had known since he was 6 years old, the particular smile he used when he was proud of something, and I looked at that smile and felt the full weight of what I was about to do. I folded the program and put it in my jacket pocket and thanked him and told him I was looking forward to it. The Fort Wayne Country Club's main dining room holds approximately 160 people at full capacity. By 7 o'clock Saturday evening, it was close to that. My sister had driven in from Indianapolis. 3 of Carol's brothers were there, which surprised me and moved me more than I expected. A dozen of my longest-standing employees sat at 2 tables near the windows, men and women who had been with me for 15 and 20 years, and who had dressed up on a Saturday evening out of loyalty I had not asked for and had not taken for granted. My son stood near the entrance, greeting guests with the practiced warmth of a man assuming a role he believes is already his. My daughter-in-law circulated through the room in a navy dress, accepting compliments about the evening with gracious efficiency. My daughter stood near the bar with a glass of water and watched everything with the stillness of someone who knows what is coming. I had eaten almost nothing all day, I stood at my assigned seat at the head table and made conversation and shook hands and accepted warm wishes from people who had watched me build something over 4 decades and wanted to celebrate that, which meant their presence that evening was genuine, even if the evening itself was not. That distinction mattered to me. It still does. Dinner was served at 7:30. The prime rib was excellent. I ate slowly and spoke to my sister about her garden, and to Carol's oldest brother about a fishing trip we had planned and never taken, and kept my hands completely steady, which required more effort than I expected. At 8:45, my son rose and tapped his glass. "I'd like to say a few words before Dad takes the microphone," he said, and the room settled into the warm, attentive silence of people prepared to feel good about something. He spoke for 7 minutes. He talked about watching me work when he was a boy. He talked about what he had learned from me, and what the business had given our family, and what it meant to him to be trusted with its future. He talked about the next chapter with a careful vagueness that I recognized as language you use when the real plan isn't ready to be announced. He was a good speaker. He always had been. When he finished, the room applauded, and he turned to me with the smile again and extended his hand toward the microphone. I stood slowly, the way I had been standing all week, and accepted the microphone, and waited for the applause to fade. "Thank you," I said. "I've been thinking about what I wanted to say tonight for several days. I think most of you know that I'm not a man who uses many words when fewer will do. But tonight, I want to make sure everyone in this room understands exactly what kind of family gathering we're having." My son's expression held for a moment and then shifted, just slightly, the way a foundation shifts before anything above it shows the change. "I'd like to start with something I recorded on Tuesday evening," I said. "In my own kitchen." I nodded to the corner of the room where Donald's technician sat at a small mixing board. The room was absolutely quiet. My son's voice came through the speakers with the clear, unhurried confidence of a man who believes he is not being recorded. "The evaluation is scheduled for the 12th. Fauser says 2 sessions should be sufficient for a preliminary finding. Once we have that, Ellis can file for the emergency guardianship petition, and we move to freeze the secondary accounts before he notices anything is missing." My daughter-in-law's voice followed immediately. "What about the inventory system?" "He's been asking Raymond about the Q2 numbers." "I'll handle Raymond," my son said. "Raymond works for the company. Once the guardianship is in place, he works for us." The silence in the room was the kind that has texture. I pressed stop. "For those of you who may be uncertain about what you just heard," I said, "my son was discussing a plan to have me declared legally incompetent through a medical evaluation conducted by a physician who has twice been investigated by the state medical board. The goal was to file for emergency guardianship, which would have transferred control of Callaway hardware supply to my son and his wife, and removed my ability to manage my own affairs or dispute the arrangement." My son stood up. His chair scraped back too hard and the sound carried. "Dad, you're misunderstanding a private conversation completely out of context. This is not what it sounds like." "I have 2 more recordings if the context is helpful," I said. I played them. The second was from Wednesday afternoon. My daughter-in-law on the phone with Dr. Fauser's office confirming the appointment. The third was from Thursday morning, my son discussing the preliminary transfer with someone whose voice I didn't recognize, but whose questions were specific enough about liquidation timelines that the meaning was unmistakable. By the time the third recording finished, 4 of my employees had stood up. My sister was crying quietly. Carol's brother had his arms crossed and was looking at my son with an expression I will not try to describe. "Additionally," I said, and I kept my voice even, because I had promised myself I would keep my voice even, "my accountant has documented $63,000 in unauthorized transfers from company accounts into a separate business entity, registered under my daughter-in-law's maiden name. Patricia Marsh, my attorney, has filed the appropriate reports. Copies of the documentation are available for any business partners who require them." My daughter-in-law sat very still. My son was still standing, and I watched his face move through anger and desperation and something that might have been shame, though I could not be certain. "Dad." His voice was different now, younger somehow. "Dad, please, let's talk about this privately. This isn't the place. You chose the place." I said quietly. You organized this evening. You invited these people. You printed the program. I reached into my jacket pocket and set the cream-colored program on the table in front of me. An evening in honor of Walter Calloway. I thought that was very nicely done. The room did not erupt the way the reception hall in the video I'd once watched had erupted. The Fort Wayne Country Club is not that kind of place. And the people in that room were not that kind of people. What happened instead was quieter, and in some ways more complete. Conversations stopped. Chairs shifted. Two of my business partners stood and walked to where I was standing, and positioned themselves beside me in a way that required no explanation. My sister came and took my arm. Carol's brothers moved as a group toward the head table with the particular deliberateness of men who have decided something. My son made 2 more attempts to reframe what people had heard. The second attempt ended when my daughter, who had not spoken all evening, walked to the front of the room and stood beside me and said simply, "We have the financial records, the recordings, and Jennifer's sworn statement. There's nothing to reframe." He looked at his sister and then at me and then at the room, and whatever he saw there was enough. He took his wife by the arm and walked to the door and left without another word. And the sound of that exit, the footsteps and the door, and then the silence after, was something I will carry for a long time. I thanked everyone for coming. I meant it. I told my employees what I was able to tell them, which was that the company was sound, that their positions were secure, and that I was not going anywhere. There was applause, and it felt different from the applause that had greeted my son's speech, less polished and more real. My sister drove home with me that night. My daughter stayed for a week. Raymond completed the full audit by the following Thursday. Patricia filed the civil fraud complaint the week after that, and the process ground into motion with the impersonal efficiency of legal machinery that does not care about family history. I changed the company's signatory documents. I updated my estate planning with Patricia's guidance, and where the documents had once listed my son as primary heir and successor, they now reflected different decisions that I will not detail here because they are not the point of this story. The pocket watch sits on my desk now. I had a jeweler clean it, and the mechanism runs perfectly. A 100-year-old piece of engineering that someone made with enough care that it outlasted everyone who originally handled it. I wind it every morning before I go to the office, which I still do, 5 days a week, because I built something worth showing up for, and I have not forgotten that. I have not heard from my son since he walked out of the country club. My daughter-in-law sent one message 2 weeks later, a long, careful message that I read twice and then set aside. My attorney advised me on the appropriate response given the pending civil matter, which was no response at all. And I followed that advice because following good advice is something I have gotten better at with age. What surprises me, when I am honest with myself, is not the anger. The anger was clean and purposeful, and I knew what to do with it. What surprises me is the ordinary grief of it. The way I still sometimes pick up the phone to call my son about something that happened at the office, some small win or a problem with a supplier or a joke I would have liked to share, and then remember that this is no longer a call I make. Carol would have known what to say about that. She was always better at the parts of life I preferred to organize my way out of. I have no wisdom about grief that she did not already have in abundance. What I do have is 11 hardware stores and 19 years of an accountant who refused to be bought, and a daughter who flew in from Portland without asking why, and a room full of people who stood up when it mattered. That is not nothing. Some mornings it feels like quite a lot. I wound the pocket watch this morning, the way I do every morning, and the small sound it made settling into its rhythm was precise and clean and true, and I put on my jacket and went to work.